So, welcome to the ADINJC's 10-minute takeaway, and this is where we're going to try and cram as much information in as we can into a 10-minute workshop. So, I'm Tom Stenson, Head of Training for the ADINJC, and today I'm joined by Lynn Barry. How you doing, Lynn?
I'm fine, thanks, Tom.
You good? So, in today's topic, we are going to be discussing the pros and cons of proactive and reactive instruction. And so our time starts now. So, what is it that we mean by proactive and reactive instruction, Lynn?
Well, to me, if somebody is being proactive with something, they're joining in with something. So as far as our job is concerned as a driving instructor, if I'm being proactive, which I like to think I am as an ADI, I try and use my intuition and what I can see ahead, manage the risks and talk to the pupil about things so that in some ways I can eliminate some things before they actually happen.
Yeah.
I think doing it that way possibly makes it more comfortable for the learner. It will mean that it could increase their confidence because they're not just feeling like the whole lesson is based around lots of faults that they're making, because we're managing those as we come in. So that to me is proactive. If I'm being more reactive, and I think there is a time to do that, it's waiting to see what they would do as a pupil, and stepping in as I need to, because safety, as you know, has always got to come first. So I would come in later and either help them when I actually needed to and wait and see what they're going to do. Because if I'm always preempting it, then I don't know, do I? But I think there's a time and a level of a pupil to actually do that. I like to be much more proactive when I start my teaching. It's not until much later on that I would become more reactive and let things happen.
Yeah. And I think from, as we said earlier, I always feel like it's very much about using the right level at the right time for the pupil, because we know that one way isn't always going to work, and it definitely isn't going to work for everybody all the time.
No, exactly. Every pupil's different. They've all got different needs and they're all at different levels, and we've always got to think about that. So I do think what you've just said is very true. But I feel that being proactive in the much earlier stages is definitely the way forward and the way I would want to teach.
Yeah. One of my philosophies, or one of my terms that I use quite a bit, is the best way to manage risk is not to let it happen in the first place. And I think especially in the early stages with a pupil, I want more positive outcomes than I do negative outcomes, because I want them to enjoy learning to drive and I want them to see the positives in it. So if I can perhaps prevent some of these issues from happening or prevent some of these faults, we get a good foundation to sort of build on. And then later on, like you say, I can perhaps let those faults play out a little bit to see how they're going to react.
I think it's about the questions that we ask as well, isn't it? I mean, if you're coming into a meeting situation and clearly there isn't space and it's starting to look like there's quite a high risk situation developing, there's no good just watching that and letting it develop right until the very end. Unless I was doing a mock test or I had got a pupil at a much more trained stage, and then even then I might have to step in. But I would want to be asking questions such as, what can you see ahead? How are you thinking of dealing with this situation that's coming up ahead of us? Tell me what you're going to do. And that way we could actually then come into it quite positively, deal with it, and then afterwards have a talk about it and say, well, how do you feel we dealt with that? You know, what did we do on approach to the hazard and the risk that was coming up? So I think it is about having good questioning skills. And then the feedback afterwards between the pupil and the ADI or PDI, so that the pupil understands how they did or what they might do differently another time. Feedback's two-way, so we would want that feedback. Have you got any examples, Tom, of
well, actually, one of the examples, I was asked about this not so long ago, in fact, just before Christmas, by a trainee that I was discussing proactive and reactive. And one of the examples we came up with was approaching a pedestrian crossing.
Right.
So where the instructor perhaps gets that sixth sense that I refer to, where they feel like perhaps the pupil hasn't spotted there's a pedestrian there, and they haven't spotted that the button's been pressed. Well, if I allow that to get too far and the level of risk too high, I'm potentially then going to have to intervene verbally or physically. So I'm saying, Fred, you need to stop for the pedestrian. Well, for me, that's very reactive. I've let it allow, or I've let it get to the point where it's too late. But if I'm more proactive, I'm using those questions, which you've just highlighted there. You know, I might be saying to Fred, what can you see up ahead? What hazards are there? If I'm early enough, I might be using more open. If I'm a little bit closer and I need to manage that risk, then yeah, I'm using more of those sort of directed questions to the learner at that point. So we don't suddenly have to use the dual controls.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention pedestrian crossings, because I've just literally got back from a lesson where my pupil had slowed down for the pedestrian crossing because there was a lady and a man there waiting to cross. And as they crossed and they got to about halfway, my pupil tried to start to move again. Now, initially, I thought, okay, I'll let him do that. But then the lady dropped her glove. And so she stopped, backed up, and went to pick the glove up, at which point I needed to say, let's just wait, because he was going to go through, and it started to get slightly uncomfortable. So I actually joined in at that stage. And then we talked about it afterwards. And he said, well, I never thought she was going, you know, to drop the glove, and I didn't think she was going to do that. And there was a nice exchange between the couple who were trying to cross after she dropped the glove and the van man who was on the other side of the road, and he did a sort of, it's okay, it's fine, but definitely we needed to stop there. So what was proactive in suddenly became quite reactive because I needed to step in. It's about the level, it's about the safety, isn't it?
And those are the ones that I refer to as the golden moments from instructors, where you can't really make it up, but it's brilliant to have that conversation after.
Yeah, we've always said use opportunities in lessons. If something like that happens, you know, our goals might be something completely different, but if something like that's happened, use it, because it's a golden opportunity to teach that little bit and for learning to take place.
No, I think one of the things that often crops up when I talk about reactive and proactive is what the pros and cons are for both of those.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I'm a firm believer, as we said earlier, that one way isn't always going to work for everybody. So I feel for myself, if I'm always being proactive, I'm sort of wrapping that pupil in cotton wool. I'm always holding their hand. So at what point are they going to be allowed to be independent if I'm always proactively helping them? Because that is really what I'm doing, is I'm helping them.
Yeah, I agree. I think being proactive can enhance their confidence. It can be less stressful perhaps for both the ADI and the pupil, but then there are the disadvantages like you've just mentioned. In the same way, there are, if we're being reactive, there's pros and cons for both.
Yeah. And I find as well with sort of that reactiveness, I know for myself, if I'm learning something, if somebody just keeps saying to me, Tom, you didn't do this very well, Tom, you didn't do that, Tom, you forgot this, I find it quite sort of a bit demeaning. I feel, you know, oh, I can't really do this. So it comes back to us choosing that right thing or that right level at the right time.
Yeah, but with being reactive, then ultimately I think if they understand, I mean, is there any reason we can't discuss this with them? What are their expectations of what we're going to do? As their level changes, we should have this conversation of what we're going to do. I'm always going to try and keep you safe. I'll come in if I need to, but I'd like to see what you can do with this and help you become independent. So if we manage their expectations, then I don't think they would be upset if something happened and we have to let them do it and then we point it out afterwards, because otherwise we're never going to know what they're going to do. So I think there's a place for both, Tom. I don't think we can always be proactive personally. I think we need to be both, and it depends on the level of the pupil.
Yeah. And I think if we can choose the right one and have that good rapport with the learner, that's going to help us to get that agreement. You know, are you going to try this on your own this time, Fred? And hopefully part of our job, which is for me one of the biggest parts, that risk management, there are going to be times where I'll allow my pupil Fred, and I'll let that fault play out, because I know that it's not going to be the end of the world if they do stall the car or they do pull off in second, because I've managed the risk. And that experiential learning for some people can be really powerful.
Yeah, I agree. There would be certain times and levels of pupil where you wouldn't want them, knowing that they were in second gear or third at a junction, it would not be a good idea to let them pull out. However, there are other places where to let them pull out in second and then see how it feels, even pull them over at the side of the road afterwards and just say, you know, it is possible to come out in second, but how did that feel? You know, would you want to do that at a busy roundabout? Should we try moving off in second? Should we see how it feels? You know, that to me would be the way to go with that. But I would certainly allow them sometimes to make those small mistakes in order to learn.
Excellent. Well, that's our 10 minutes up, Lynn.
Wow.
So hopefully, it goes quick. Hopefully we've managed to cover the basics there on what proactive and reactive instruction is. Hopefully we've given some examples, and hopefully anyone listening to this or watching this can go away and think of some of those situations and examples they've had in their lessons, and then maybe reflect on some of the decisions they've made at the time.
I think it's very much what we're trying to do here is help people think and you know, think what they would do, and they may disagree or they may agree with us. You know, it's about making people think, I feel, with these 10 minutes. Obviously we do other training other than these free 10-minute takeaways, and people can go to the website if they want to see what else we do at ADINJC.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Tom.